We have to get inside now. Hold on, brother. We're almost there. Please! Somebody help us! Bring him inside. Hurry up, gentlemen, before he catches his death out here.
Mister, is there one door in this whole county that'll open for us tonight? 4 men stood in the rain, soaked to the skin, cracked leather vests gone black with water, beards dripping. Behind them, 4 dead motorcycles they had pushed by hand for the better part of 2 hours. Behind that, 5 houses with the porch lights off and the curtains pulled. Amos Freeman was 67 years old. He had $31 in the cash drawer of a garage his daddy built, and a folded letter from the county on his workbench that said the taxes came due Friday. "Please," the biggest one said, and his voice broke on the word. "We knocked everywhere. One fella called the law on us. My brother here, his heart's going wrong. He needs to sit down before he falls down." Amos looked at the 4 of them a long time. He heard, somewhere in the back of his head, every voice in Cedar Hollow that had ever whispered about men who looked like these men. Then the screen door behind him swung open. Della stepped out onto the concrete apron, in her flour-dusted apron, a dish rag still in one hand. She looked at the 4 strangers. She looked at her husband. "Amos," she said, "bring them in out of that rain. Della, you see what they—" "I see 4 cold men, and one that can't hardly stand. Bring them in." That was the whole of it. That was the yes. 4 nights later, 60 motorcycles would come up that same gravel road at first light, and the name Freeman would be spoken in 4 states before the month was out. But Amos and Della didn't know any of that yet. All they knew was the rain, and the 4 men, and the one whose lips were going gray. Let me back you up 2 days, to the Thursday before the storm, so you understand what kind of man opened that door. Amos Freeman had done the same thing every morning for 44 years. He flipped the sign on the bay window at 5 in the morning, sharp before the sun. He touched the corner of the photograph nailed above the tool bench, a picture of a broad-shouldered man in coveralls, and he said the same 2 words he always said. "Morning, Pop." Then he crossed the little breezeway to the lunch counter next door and kissed his wife. Della was already at the flat top by then. Apron tied, coffee going, grits on low. The whole place smelled like bacon and biscuits and the particular sweetness of her cornbread, which she made in a black skillet older than their marriage. "Morning, sugar." "Morning, baby. You sleep any?" Roof dripped over the closet again. "I heard the pan catching it," she said, and she slid him a mug without ever looking up. 44 years. They had stopped needing to look. The Freeman place sat where Old Mill Pond Road met the county highway, 4 miles outside the little town of Cedar Hollow, in the green folded-up hills of East Tennessee. 2 buildings and a small, tired house behind them. Freeman's Auto and Machine on the left, built by Amos's father, Isaiah, in 1954, back when a black man could not get a bank loan in that county, and built the whole thing board by board with cash he kept in a coffee can. Della's Kitchen on the right, a lunch counter she had opened in 1983 after she quit waiting tables at the diner in town. A covered walkway ran between the 2 buildings, and they ate their dinner out there together at 6 o'clock every evening. 2 plates, 2 mugs, rain or shine, 44 years running. It was a small life, a quiet one, and it was about to slip through their fingers. The county tax letter had been sitting on the bench for 2 months. Amos kept turning it face down. Della kept pretending she didn't notice him turn it face down. Friday was the deadline, and Friday was 3 days off. That Thursday morning, he counted the cash drawer while the coffee cooled. $31, a 5, a 10, some singles, and a folded 20 he had been holding back in case the tow truck needed a new starter. He shut the drawer and looked at his own hands laid flat on the bench. Those hands had rebuilt more engines than he could count. They had set a stranger's broken arm one time, splinted it with a paint stir stick and a rag, when a family blew a tire in an ice storm and there was no ambulance coming for an hour. Those hands had lowered his mother into the ground, and then his father, and then, the year he turned 50, his only son. Now, those hands were fixing to sign a paper and hand somebody the keys to his daddy's shop. He hadn't told Della. She knew. She always knew. But neither one of them was willing to say it out loud yet, so they didn't. The trouble wasn't laziness, and it wasn't drink. The trouble was 2 miles up the highway, where a chain outfit with a bright plastic sign and a phone app and a coupon book had been quietly bleeding his customers for a solid 10 years. The young folks around Cedar Hollow didn't know what a master mechanic was worth. They knew what 15% off looked like on a text message. Amos had 3 steady customers left. Miss Odessa, whose husband had passed in the spring and who mostly came for the company, the Pruitt boys, who brought their late daddy's truck in on Sundays, and Ray from the filling station, who came by once a month for an oil change he could have done himself and stayed for cornbread. Della's counter did a hair better. Truckers pulled off the highway for her sweet tea, which had something of a reputation all the way up to Knoxville. But a hair better than nothing is still close to nothing. She kept a coffee can on the counter with a strip of tape that read, "Pay what you're able." Most weeks she lost money on that can. Some days a driver would fold a 20 into it and be gone out the door before she could hand back change. That was Della all over. She poured the coffee first and worried about the coins after. The hardest part of the Thursday came at 7 when their granddaughter came by before school. Simone was 17, top of her class. She had built a little working steam turbine out of scrap for a science fair when she was 12, and the judge had accused her of buying it until she took it apart and put it back together in front of him. A week earlier, a thick envelope had come in the mail. Georgia Institute of Technology, School of Mechanical Engineering. Admitted. Simone had run the whole quarter-mile down Old Mill Pond Road, holding that letter over her head like it was on fire, and Amos had cried right there in the bay with grease still black under his nails. Tuition ran close to $44,000 a year. There were $31 in the drawer and a tax letter that said Friday. Simone didn't know about the letter. Della had been plain about it. "She doesn't hear a word of it from me, Amos. Not till she's signed everything she needs to sign, and it can't be taken from her. She'll find a way to fight for it. Let her fight." So, that morning, Simone sat at the counter eating a biscuit and talking a mile a minute about heat transfer and turbine blades, and Amos sat across from her with his hand around a coffee mug and a smile on his face and the whole quiet lie of the morning sitting on his chest like a truck battery. Della watched him from behind the flat top. Their eyes met one time. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not yet, baby?" He nodded and bit his biscuit and kept smiling. That was Thursday. The rain started Saturday around noon, and it was not the kind that blows through in 20 minutes. It was the other kind. It came down straight and gray and steady and did not let up. By 2, the ditches along the county road were running full. By 3, the low spot where the creek passed under the old iron bridge had gone from a creek to a brown moving lake. By 4, the radio was cutting in every few minutes with a flood warning for the low ground and a mention of a possible twister to the west. By 5, Della had brought her sign in and was wiping down the counter for the night. The lunch rush had been 2 truckers and a fellow buying pie. Amos stood in the mouth of the bay with a rag over his shoulder, watching the water sheet across the lot, a transmission half apart on the bench behind him for a job worth $80 that the customer plainly wasn't coming back for. He was reaching for the light switch, about to go eat early, when he heard it. Not engines, something heavier and lower and wetter than engines. A dragging, clicking sound. He squinted through the rain and made out 4 shapes way down the road, coming slow up the shoulder. 4 big men leaning into 4 big machines, walking them by hand like men pushing something dead. He could hear the dry click of chains that weren't turning under power anymore. He would learn the whole of it later, in pieces, from the men themselves. About a mile back, the road dipped into that hollow, where the creek crossed under the bridge, and by early afternoon, the hollow had a foot of moving water across the road. The lead rider, a mountain of a man they called Bear, had eased his machine down into it at a walking pace, sure he could push it across. Custom bike, the kind you don't replace on a welder's wage. The water climbed past the pipes and got sucked up into the intake, and the engine choked and died right in the middle of the flood. The 3 behind him made it maybe 20 feet further before theirs quit too, one after another like a string of firecrackers going out in the wet. It took them the better part of an hour to wrestle 4 dead motorcycles out of that hollow and onto dry pavement. Then they started knocking. The first house had a light burning on the porch. A woman pulled the curtain back, took one look, and let the curtain fall. They knocked at the second twice and got nothing. At the third, an old man came to the door with a shotgun leaned against the frame just behind him where they couldn't miss seeing it, and he said, "You boys best keep on walking," and shut the door. The fourth was a repair shop, and Bear was sure, right up until the last second, that a fellow mechanic would open up. They could see the man inside working under a truck. They knocked. He looked up, walked to the front, and turned the sign in the window from open to closed. It wasn't yet 3 in the afternoon. The fifth was worse than all of them. One of the four, a lean, quiet man they called Priest, went up to the door alone, figuring 4 of them at once looked like a threat. A woman opened it on the chain, 3 inches. He got about half a sentence out before she slammed it. A minute later, they heard her through the kitchen window, on the phone. "There's 4 of them out here. Big, covered in tattoos. I'm scared." The sheriff's deputy came out 15 minutes later, ran all 4 licenses, and found exactly what there was to find, which was nothing. Because these 4 men were a pipe welder, a long-haul driver, a roofing contractor, and an army medic who had done 2 tours overseas. The deputy was decent about it, apologized even, but the last thing he said before he pulled off was, "This isn't the friendliest stretch of road for folks who look like you. If I were you, I'd keep moving." So they kept moving. 2 more miles in the rain, blistered and soaked and shaking with cold, the medic, whose name was Doc, watching Bear go grayer around the mouth with every 100 yards until they came around the long bend by the old mill pond and saw a warm yellow light through the rain and a wooden sign that read, "Freeman's Auto and Machine, Della's Kitchen, since 1954. Bear, 6'4", 280 pounds, a beard down to the 3rd button of his shirt, and his little girl's name inked across the side of his throat, leaned on the handlebars of his dead machine and coughed hard. "Last one, boys," he said. "If this door says no, I'm done walking." And that brings us right back to where we started. To Amos standing in the mouth of the bay, watching 4 soaked strangers come up his gravel, to every whispered warning Cedar Hollow had ever put in his head, standing right there in his lot. To Della coming out the screen door with a rag in her hand, looking once at the men and once at her husband, and saying the only thing that needed saying. "Bring them in." Amos pulled his coat off the hook and went out into it. The 4 men had stopped at the edge of the lot, like they were afraid to come one step closer until somebody told them they could. "Roll them under the overhang out of the wet," he called. "Then get yourselves inside." Bear tried to say thank you and coughed instead, and the coughing didn't stop, and the other 3 got under his arms before he could go down. Amos moved quicker than a man his age with 2 bad knees had any right to. He got Bear's other arm over his own shoulder and steered him toward the warm side of the building. "What's your name, brother?" "Bear, it's Cole Whitfield." "All right, Cole, we're going to sit you down. What's wrong with you?" "Heart, got a bad valve, they say. Army left me with it. My pills are in the saddlebag. I can't—" "What kind of pill?" "Beta blocker, little white one." Amos looked over his shoulder at the youngest of the 4, the one with a faded red cross patch sewn onto his vest. "Son, get his pills, now." "Yes, sir." Doc was already gone into the rain. Inside, Della had a wood stove going in the back room before any of them got through the door, and she was pulling quilts down off a high shelf. She didn't so much as glance at the size of the man they walked in. She went straight to Cole, put one small hand flat on his cold cheek, and said, "Oh, honey, you're froze half to death. Sit down before you fall down." 280 pounds of pipe welder sat down like a schoolboy. She had his vest off in 30 seconds and folded it careful over the back of a chair, the way you'd handle a soldier's coat. Then his soaked shirt. Then she wrapped him in a heavy quilt, the one she had pieced together the winter Simone was born. "Where are those pills?" "Coming, ma'am." Doc came back through the door with water running off him and pressed the bottle into her hand. She got one down him with sips of warm water, wiped his forehead with a clean cloth, laid 2 fingers against the side of his neck, and felt his pulse for a long, slow count. "Amos, he's warm. Fever's coming up in him. I see it." She never once asked his club or his record or whether he was a danger to her. She talked to him like she'd raised him. "Cole, baby, you got a wife at home?" "Yes, ma'am." "You got children?" "A girl, Wren, she's 6. "Wren, that's a pretty name. You're going to see that little bird again, you hear me? You keep her face in your mind and you hold on." His eyes filled up and spilled over, and he nodded. Out at the counter, the other three were dripping all over Della's clean floor. Priest, lean and quiet and watchful. A big one they called Mule, wide as a door, with a scar through one eyebrow. And Doc, the medic, who kept glancing back toward the room where Cole was. Della took one look at the three of them. You, and you, and you. Sit. They sat. You're soaked, and you're scared for your friend, and standing there worrying doesn't help him one bit. So you're gonna eat, and then you're gonna sit still and let me do my work. We clear? Yes, ma'am, Mule said, quiet as a boy. She set 3 plates down hard, cold fried chicken from the noon rush, cornbread, a jar of sweet tea with the sides sweating. Mule picked up a piece of cornbread, and his hand was shaking so bad he nearly dropped it. He bit into it. His jaw started to work funny. He put the cornbread back down on the plate and dragged the back of one enormous hand across his eyes. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I ain't. Nobody's. Eat your cornbread, son. Made it fresh this morning. He ate it with the tears running down into his beard the whole time, and nobody at that counter said a word about it. Priest hadn't spoken since he came in. He was watching Della move, watching the way she touched Cole's shoulder every single time she walked away from him. A small pat, like you'd do to a sleeping child, so they'd know you hadn't gone far. After a while, he cleared his throat. 5 doors said no to us today. One of them put the law on us. Della didn't look up from the soup she'd started. Folks mostly see what they've already decided to see. You didn't even ask if we were dangerous. You were cold and hungry, and one of you was dying on my porch. That's the only thing I needed to know about you. Priest turned his face to the black window so the other 2 wouldn't catch it. They caught it anyway. Nobody said anything. In the back, Amos was on the old CB, raising the volunteer fire station. The iron bridge was underwater. No ambulance could cross until the creek dropped, and the man on the radio guessed that wouldn't be before 9, maybe half past. He explained about the heart. The dispatcher told him, keep the man warm, keep him still, keep water in him. Amos hung the mic back on its hook and came out to find Della already pulling dry clothes out of a paper sack from the back closet. His old work shirts, a couple of flannels. Doc, you're about Amos's size. These'll fit 2 of you. Socks in the basket. There's a wash basin under that sink and a curtain in the storeroom you can pull for privacy. Go on. She said it like a foreman on a job site. And 3 grown men who scared whole towns did exactly as they were told, without a word of argument. Doc stopped at the storeroom door and looked back at Amos. Sir, we didn't earn this. 5 houses already told us no. Amos didn't answer right off. He was thinking about his father, about a story Isaiah used to tell, about a diner that stood directly across the road from his own shop and would not sell him a sandwich through the window, and what a thing like that does to a man's insides over 40 years. He just said, get out of those wet clothes, son, before you catch what your friends got. The ambulance made it across a little after 10, once the creek dropped enough. The medic who came in checked Cole over and pulled Della aside and said, quiet. Ma'am, those pills and keeping him warm the way you did. He could have gone into an arrest tonight. You may have kept this man alive. Della just nodded. She squeezed Cole's hand at the door, and he held on to it. Mrs. Freeman. Yeah, baby. What's your whole name? I need to remember it right. Della Freeman. That's my Amos out there. He said it back to himself 3 times under his breath, as they wheeled him out into the dark. Low, like a man saying a prayer he was scared he'd forget. Priest pulled a fat envelope out of his vest and set it on the counter. It had close to $2,000 in it, everything the 4 of them had between them. He pushed it across. Della pushed it right back. Honey, you put that away. We didn't do it for money. Money's got nothing to do with any of this. Priest's eyes went again, and this time he didn't turn away to hide it. Nobody stops for us, ma'am. In 15 years, nobody. You stopped. At the door, Doc slid a plain little card under the coffee can, where Della wouldn't find it till later. The bike stayed in the lot under a tarp. The men were gone before midnight. At 11, Amos and Della sat out in the breezeway with 2 mugs of coffee, the same as they'd done every night for 44 years. You think he makes it? Amos said. He makes it, Della said. That one wants to see his little girl too bad not to. Neither one of them had the first idea that in 4 days, the road out front would be full of 60 motorcycles. Sunday came up gray and washed out, but the rain had quit. Amos was out front by 6, looking over what the storm had done. a downspout hanging off the garage by one screw, half the shingles gone off the kitchen roof. The old sign leaned another inch toward the ditch. He stood there with his coffee and felt less about the damage than he thought he would. What he kept feeling instead was Cole's face when he said his little girl's name. The card came out from under the coffee can when Della lifted it to fill the machine. 2 words and a phone number in plain block letters. Ashen Wolves. And under it, MC. Neither one of them had ever heard of the Ashen Wolves. It didn't mean a thing to them. What they had no way of knowing was that at that same hour, in a hospital 60 miles south, Cole Whitfield was sitting up in a bed with a monitor beeping next to him, on the phone with a man named Gideon Slate. Gideon was the president of the Ashen Wolves, and his voice came through the line like a truck idling over gravel. Cole told him the whole thing: the flood, the dead bikes, 5 doors, the deputy, and then the 2 old people out on Old Mill Pond Road who took one look at 4 bikers in the rain and didn't even blink, and had less to their name than the men they were feeding, and pushed $2,000 back across the counter like it was an insult. Gideon was quiet for a while. Then he said 2 things. The first was, "Lord have mercy, Cole." The second was, "Don't you move. Don't argue with a single doctor. Let me make some calls." And he hung up. By that Sunday night, more than 60 phones would ring across 3 states. But Amos and Della thought it was over. They thought they'd fed some cold men and sent them on their way. And that was the end of it. Monday morning, Della opened the counter at 5, like always, and there was a box on the porch. Plain brown cardboard, no tape, no name. She folded back the flap. Inside was a roll of good electrical tape, 2 oil filters still in the box, a fresh can of brake cleaner, a bundle of clean shop rags. Maybe $50 of supplies. No note. She carried it in and set it on the counter and stood looking at it a minute, then went and got Amos. "Somebody left this." "Who'd leave that?" "I don't know, baby." He carried it out to the shop, but she didn't put it away. She left it sitting on the counter where she could see it, and she looked at it 3 or 4 more times before noon. Monday evening, 2 men she'd never laid eyes on pulled in and came in polite as churchgoers, ordered sandwiches and coffee, asked how long the counter had been open. One of them said, "Mind if I get a picture of your sign? My wife likes old road signs." She said sure. He took 2. They left $40 on a $12 ticket and were gone. She showed Amos the bills that night, and he said some folks are just generous. She said, and put the 40 in an envelope by itself. Tuesday, Amos drove up to Ray's filling station for milk and stopped in front of the corkboard by the door he'd walked past 1,000 times without reading. There was a faded flyer thumbtacked in the corner, a gray wolf's head over crossed wrenches. Ashen Wolves Motorcycle Club, annual ride for the Children's Hospital. Same wolf that was painted on the tank of Cole's dead bike out in the bay. This time he read the small print at the bottom. More than $300,000 raised since 1998. Ray came over with the milk. "That thing's been up there for years. Probably some kind of racket." Amos didn't answer. He paid for the milk and walked out. Tuesday night at 1:45 to midnight, Della's phone buzzed on the kitchen table. It was a number she didn't know. The message read, "Mrs. Freeman, this is Doc from Saturday. Please open your place at 6 sharp tomorrow morning. Some brothers are coming through. Don't be scared. They look meaner than they are." She read it twice, then carried the phone into the bedroom and showed Amos. He read it again. "How many brothers?" "Doesn't say. Says they look meaner than they are." She looked through the doorway at the box of supplies still sitting on the counter, then back at her husband. "Amos," she said, "we're going to need to make more than 1 pot of coffee." At 2 minutes before 6 on Wednesday morning, Della Freeman had 3 pots going instead of 1. By 10 past 6, she'd understand why. Amos was outside dragging the trash barrel to the edge of the lot, and he kept looking up toward the highway every couple minutes. He didn't say he was nervous, but he'd brought the county tax letter in off the bench and folded it into his back pocket like a man carrying a summons to court. The fog lay low and thick across Old Mill Pond Road. The sky was the flat color of an old dime. The lot sat empty. Then he heard it. Way off to the south, a low rolling sound. Then more of it stacked on top. Then more on top of that, until it stopped being the sound of engines and became something more like weather. A front rolling up the valley toward him. Amos set the trash barrel down. Della came to the mouth of the breezeway with her dish towel still in her hands. The fog broke open at the bend. 60 motorcycles. 60. Coming up Old Mill Pond Road 2x2 in a tight column, headlights burning holes in the last of the fog, like a parade nobody in Cedar Hollow had gotten word about. Behind the bikes came 3 pickup trucks loaded down with toolboxes. Behind those, a flatbed stacked with lumber and shingles and drywall and paint. 2 work vans, one lettered Slate Construction and one lettered Holloway Roofing. A trailer with a little generator on it, and bringing up the rear, a man with a camera slung around his neck, riding on the back of a bike. They rolled into the lot in that same tight formation and idled. Then, on some hand signal Amos never saw given, 60 engines cut at the same second, and the quiet dropped down over the whole property like a wet blanket. Amos did not move. 60 bearded men in gray leather vests stood in his daddy's driveway. 60 pairs of boots on his gravel. Every last thing Cedar Hollow had ever whispered about men like these was standing in his lot at 6 in the morning, and it had come to fix his roof. The man in front swung a leg off his bike, bald as a river stone, silver beard down to the middle of his chest, a wolf inked climbing up the side of his neck, the word President stitched across the back of his cut. He crossed the gravel one heavy step at a time and stopped an arm's length from Amos, and he stuck out a hand the size of a Bible. "You Amos Freeman?" "Yes, sir." "Gideon Slate, President, Ashen Wolves. You the one that pulled Cole out of that flood Saturday night." "My wife did most of it. I just carried him." "Then shake my hand, brother, before I go and embarrass myself in front of 60 grown men." Amos shook it. Gideon's grip was iron, and he held on 3 seconds longer than a handshake, then let go and coughed hard into his fist and blinked at the fog. "Damn allergies," he said to nobody. He turned to the lot, and his voice came out like a drill sergeant on a parade ground. "All right, you know why we're here. Tools out, mouth shut, work fast. We got till dark. And not one of you is going to scare Mrs. Freeman's customers. You hear me? Park around back, take the rags off your heads if she asks, and mind your manners. We're guests here today. You act like it." The whole crowd started moving at once, like one animal. Tarps came off the flatbed. Ladders went up against the eaves. And out of the passenger seat of the lead pickup, easy, careful, big mule was helping Cole Whitfield down onto the gravel. Cole had a walking cast on one leg and a grin on him like a boy on Christmas morning. Della came down off the breezeway slow, one hand up over her mouth. Cole hobbled toward her on a crutch. 280 pounds, a beard to his chest, his daughter's name on his throat, the very man half the county would cross the road to get away from. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and bent his head way down. "Mrs. Freeman, my little girl's name is Wren. She turned 6 last month. Saturday night I was fixing to leave her without a daddy. You gave her one back." And he broke down crying right there in front of 60 men, the raw kind that comes up out of somebody who hasn't let himself do it in a long, long time. Della reached up and pulled the giant down into her shoulder and held on, and he shook once, hard, into her apron. 60 men in that lot found their tools very interesting all of a sudden. Gideon stood next to Amos watching it, and he took his glasses off. His eyes were red at the rims. "That's the toughest man I know, Mr. Freeman. 2 tours, buried friends. I never once seen him cry, not since his mama passed. You 2 broke him clean open. Best thing that can happen to a hard man." Amos couldn't find any words. He just watched his wife and the weeping giant. "I don't do speeches, so I'll keep it short," Gideon said. "Cole called me from a hospital bed Sunday morning. Told me 5 doors said no to him in the rain. Told me the law came. Told me 2 old people who've got about nothing to their name took one look and didn't hesitate, and then wouldn't take his money." He was quiet a second. "People look at us and they see the beards and the ink, and they've got the whole story wrote before we open our mouths. 5 doors proved that Saturday. Y'all didn't write the story first. You just opened the door. So, we came to say thank you the only way we know how, which is with our hands." Cole lifted his head off Della's shoulder and wiped his face and found his voice. "Mr. Freeman, priest over there, his name's Elias. He runs Slate's crew. He's donating the whole rebuild. Garage and kitchen both. Top to bottom, labor and materials. Mule's daddy owns Holloway Roofing. He's putting a new roof on both shops and on your house out back." Della's hand went to her mouth again. She had not told one living soul that the roof over her own bed leaked. Amos managed to get out. "We only helped a man." Gideon rounded on him, not unkind but hard. You helped a man everybody else left in the road to die. Don't you say only to me, Amos Freeman. Not ever. You understand? Yes, sir. Gideon, now, where's the coffee, Mrs. Freeman? And the work began. It didn't stop for 11 weeks. That first Wednesday alone, 60 men tore the rotten siding off the garage, hauled a whole dumpster of storm trash to the road, and poured a fresh concrete pad in front of both buildings before the sun went down. By the second weekend, Elias had the garage stripped to the bare studs and was building it back better than it started. A hydraulic lift went in, donated by a member who ran a parts warehouse 2 counties over. New compressor, new lights, new benches, and every last tool that Isaiah Freeman had hung on that back wall in 1954. Every wrench and every file and every old timing light got taken down, photographed, and hung back in the exact same spot when the new wall went up. Gideon had given the order himself. Nobody touches the daddy's wall. The kitchen got the same. New booths, a real coffee station, a flat top big enough to feed an army sent up by a member in Knoxville who ran a restaurant supply. The breezeway between the 2 buildings got a real roof and a bench. And by the 6th week, a little garden with 3 raised beds and 2 rose bushes. Della had mentioned one time, years back, that she'd always wanted a porch garden. Nobody told her they remembered. They just did it. 40 of those 60 men turned wrenches for a living. On the second weekend, they worked shifts alongside Amos and cleared out his whole backlog. Miss Odessa's transmission, the Pruitt boys' truck, a farmer's combine clutch that had sat in the weeds for 3 months. Amos stood in the middle of it all, teaching the younger men his daddy's old tricks, the way you can hear a bad bearing by pressing a long screwdriver to the housing and putting your ear to the handle, like a doctor with a stethoscope. Watch, he kept saying. Watch here. On about the 6th day, Amos took a break and sat on an upturned bucket behind the shop with his coffee. An older man came around the corner with 2 cups, mid-70s, a face like a dry creek bed, a vest with patches going all the way back to Vietnam. He sat down on a second bucket without asking and handed Amos one of the cups. They drank a minute without talking. Then the old man said, quiet, "My daddy ran a body shop up in Morristown. Back in '66, a black man came in looking for work. My daddy told me 30 years later that man had the best hands he'd ever watched on an engine. And he sent him off because of what the neighbors would think." He took a long sip. "My daddy died in '94. That was the one thing I ever heard him say sorry for. Just the one time, out loud, near the end." He stood up slow. "Folks look at this vest and see a mean old biker. Folks look at you and see whatever their granddaddy taught them to see. Us riding down here this week, some of it's about 100 years too late, from both directions." He put his hand out. "Name's Ford. They call me Preacher." And he walked back toward the ladders. Amos sat there a long while. He didn't tell Della that night. He told her 2 weeks later, in the dark, after a long quiet, and she just took his hand and didn't say anything at all. At the end of the 3rd week, Gideon came up the breezeway and dropped a manila folder on the table where Amos was eating lunch. "Brothers took a vote," he said. "Open it." Inside was a letter, the Ashen Wolves Trades and Engineering Fund, awarded to Simone Freeman, Georgia Institute of Technology, School of Mechanical Engineering, 4 years, tuition and books, and a housing stipend. Funded by the members, $96,000. Amos set his sandwich down. His eyes filled and the tears just ran down into his coffee, and he didn't wipe them. "Don't you go soft on me, Freeman," Gideon said, and his own voice wasn't steady. "We'll take it," Amos said. "On one thing, make it every year. One kid from a county like this one, doesn't matter what they look like, trade school, engineering, cooking like my Della, and they've got to do 1 free job a year for somebody who can't pay. Every year, that's the rule." Gideon looked at him a long second, then pulled a pen out of his vest, clicked it, and laid it on the table. "You're a pain in my neck, you know that? Done. I'll strong-arm the board on Monday. Sign the paper." Amos signed. They reopened on a Sunday, 11 weeks after the storm, and the whole town came. There was a banner across the breezeway and a red ribbon across the door, and the mayor gave a little speech nobody remembers. 80 Ashen Wolves stood in formation with their bikes lined up like a color guard. Simone cut the ribbon. Della cried. Amos shook hands until his arm went numb. At the tail end of it, Cole hobbled up to Della, holding a small frame, and he handed it over without a word. Inside was a child's drawing, crayon on notebook paper. A man with a big beard, a woman in an apron, a little house with a heart drawn on the roof, and along the bottom, in the careful blocky printing of a 6-year-old, it said, "Thank you for saving my daddy. Love, Ren." Della hung it behind the counter that same afternoon, and it is still hanging there. The story didn't stay in Cedar Hollow. By the Tuesday after reopening, a paper out of Knoxville ran a front-page photo of Della with her arms around Cole in the breezeway. Under the headline, 5 doors said no. The 6th said come in. By Friday, it was on the wire. That weekend, the photographer's clip of Gideon standing in the lot at dawn passed 8 million views online, and the club's page, which Amos had never once heard of, went from a few thousand followers to 400,000 inside a month. A woman in Ireland wrote in the comments that she was crying on a bus. Saturdays on Old Mill Pond Road stopped looking like Saturdays. The lot filled up at sunup. Bikers from 4 states pulled in just to shake Amos's hand. Couples drove down from the city to eat at Della's counter. Truckers rerouted their whole run through Cedar Hollow to carry off a mason jar of her sweet tea. Inside of 6 months, Amos had a 4-week wait for any big job, and he hired his first apprentice in 20 years, a young man named Terrell, who drove down from 2 counties over after he saw the news, knocked on the bay door and said, "Mr. Freeman, I want to learn from you." Amos hired him before lunch. Della took on 2 single mothers from the trailer park down the road, paid them a fair wage, and sent them home every night with whatever was left in the warming tray. One of them had been about to move her kids into her sister's spare room because rent was due. She didn't have to anymore. The town shifted slow, but it shifted. The same regulars who'd whispered about men like these 2 months back now came by on Saturdays to gawk at the wall of chrome in the new lot. Ray at the filling station took down the racket face he used to make about the flyer and put a donation jar on his own counter. The diner across the highway, the one Amos's father couldn't buy a sandwich from in 1962, hired 3 new people to keep up with the overflow. Up at Georgia Tech, Simone started her freshman year. She hung her great-grandfather Isaiah's old canvas work apron on the wall of her dorm room, and next to it, she pinned an Ashen Wolves patch that Cole had mailed her in an envelope with a note that read, "Honorary member for life." She called home every Sunday after church. Della always held the phone. Amos always waved from behind a transmission. A year out from the storm, the first real Ashen Wolves scholarship went to a 19-year-old single mother named Keisha, studying diesel mechanics at the community college. 2 months later, a second went to an 18-year-old named Marco, who wanted to run his own kitchen someday. Amos handed them their certificates at the counter, and Della sent them home with a peach pie apiece and the same one line for both of them. "Now you go on, baby, and don't you forget the rule." A bronze plate went up by the front door. Gideon paid for it out of his own pocket. It read, "This place stayed open because 2 people answered the door when nobody else would." Ford, the old one they called Preacher, drove down from Morristown 1 Saturday a month for the rest of his life. He'd buy an oil change he didn't need, and a slice of pie he did. And he and Amos never said much across the lot, just nodded at each other. Della watched it from behind the counter and knew exactly what was passing between those 2 men in those nods. Cole brought Ren down on weekends. She'd sit on an upturned bucket in the bay watching Amos work, asking him 100 questions, calling him Grandpa Freeman. One Sunday she fell asleep with her cheek against a tire, and Amos carried her into the back and Della laid her on the cot under the same quilt she'd wrapped Cole in on the worst night of his life. And she stood looking down at the sleeping child a long minute before she covered her up. And she didn't say a word. She just smiled. A little over a year after the storm, on a cold, foggy morning in October, a stranger pulled into Freeman's auto at 20 past 5, before the sun was up. Amos, 68 now, was already in the bay with a pot of coffee going. Della's biscuits were in the new oven next door. The fog on Old Mill Pond Road was the thick kind that eats headlights at 50 feet. A rusted-out little sedan limped into the lot with steam coming off the hood. The driver was a young woman, early 20s, in a thrift store blazer and flat shoes, her eyes red from crying. She came toward the bay with a folded sheet of paper shaking in her hand. "Sir, I don't have any money. I've got a job interview in the city in 2 hours. A real one. My first real one. Please, is there any way you... Amos held up one hand, gentle. The same hand he'd held up to a man called Bear in the rain a year before. Pop the hood, sweetheart. Della appeared in the breezeway with her dish towel and took one look at the girl. Honey, when's the last time you ate anything? The girl couldn't answer. Della nodded once. Come sit down. Biscuits are up in 5. We'll feed you while he works. 40 minutes later, the car was running clean. A tightened clamp, a belt off Amos's scrap shelf, everything that was low topped back off. The girl had eaten 2 biscuits with gravy and drunk a cup of coffee, and Della had packed her a paper sack with 2 more biscuits and an apple and a hard-boiled egg. You eat that egg before you go in there, baby. Protein steadies your nerves. The girl tried to leave her phone on the counter as some kind of security. Amos pressed something into her palm instead. A business card, the new shop logo on the front, and on the back, in his own hand, 4 words. You don't owe us. Under it, he'd written, pass it on. She drove off into the fog, and they watched the taillights disappear. Simone was home for the fall break. She was in the bay with a transmission spread out in pieces on a clean tarp, and she looked up. Grandpa, Grandma, you didn't charge her one thing. Della wiped her hands on her apron. Baby, a year ago, 60 men that this whole county was scared of rode down that road to save us. You think we're going to charge a girl for a belt and a biscuit? Amos laughed low. Simone shook her head and smiled and went back to her transmission, and somewhere out on Old Mill Pond Road, faint through the fog, came the sound of motorcycles. Saturday riders, on their way down. I want to leave you with the thing I keep chewing on about this one. It isn't the 60 bikes at dawn, as good as that is. It's the 4 seconds on the porch before the door opened. 5 other people saw 4 soaked men in a storm and decided that being scared of how somebody looked mattered more than a man's failing heart. One of them called the law. Della opened her door anyway, and she called that man baby before she knew a single thing about him. She fed a crying stranger cornbread and never once asked what club he rode with. She just asked when he'd last eaten. So, let me put it to you, honest. If it had been you standing in that kitchen window with 5 neighbors already turned them away, with the news telling you to be afraid of men who look like that, would you have opened the door? Not the answer that sounds good, the real one. If this one got to you, leave a heart in the comments. Tell me in one word what you'd have done, and share it with somebody who's forgotten that decent people still exist. Because somewhere out on a dark road tonight, somebody's knocking and the 6th door hasn't opened yet. Maybe it's yours.